Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today are some of the Conquistadors from Wargames Atlantic. Now they did very kindly send along a couple of sprues of these guys for me to check out, and I gotta say, I'm still pretty impressed with them, and they're definitely worth having a look at. I will make sure that there is a link to those in the description, because not only do they work for Conquistadors, but with the extra sprue that comes in the box with weapons and heads and what have you, they'll also work for 30 Years' War and similar sort of 16th century troops. If you're looking at making something which uses a lot of human troops on the cheap, maybe some sort of empire, then these guys would probably be worth checking out. So all of the paints for these will be listed in the description below, same as always. Let's get started. So of course, once your miniatures are assembled, first thing to do is to prime them. Now I've used here matte white, and I want to show you this because you'll see it has gone a little bit funny on some of these areas. Now the reason for this is that the temperature outside was extremely low, and I hadn't let the can itself come up to a suitable temperature. Now a way that you can do that is to literally just tuck the primer can under your arm and wander around for 10-15 minutes or so. Just bring it up near body heat. Some folks will recommend popping it on a radiator or something. I'm not convinced by how safe that might be, so 10 minutes under your arm will be fine. I didn't do that, so I've got a little bit of speckling, and it's slightly glossy and translucent in some areas, but it's still going to work perfectly for painting over the top of. So rather than gumming up all of the detail like that, I'm quite happy to leave them as they are, and we'll get started painting. We're going to start with one of the areas we're most likely to end up splurging over the rest of his gear, and that's going to be his skin. Now here I'm starting with Topaz skin from the Army Painter, because it's nice and deep, got a little bit of reddish warmth to it, which is going to be super for our Conquistadors. As you'll see, it covers very well. Once this layer has dried though, I'll just wait and see whether or not I get any of the primer show through, and if I do, I can give it a second coat anywhere I need to. If you've got fellas who do have beards, just paint straight over the top of the beard. Now that will look super dark when we put it on, especially when it's surrounded by white, but trust me, we've got plenty of work to do. What I'm going to turn to now is a couple of different colors, and you can mix these up as much as you want. You don't feel as though you have to follow exactly what I'm doing here, because fashion. Let you do whatever you like. I'm going to start with Urban Buff for the breeches on this chap. And this will cover very well. Still going to need to come back and give him a second coat once this is finished. But once I have done this guy's breeches, I'll put him aside and I'll use the same color to paint in the sleeves on this chappy here. Now, by picking 2 or 3 different colors, now they don't necessarily all need to be beige or off-white or what have you. Quite commonly, these would be quite a bright color. But even old Don Cortez actually wrote that uniformity went straight out the window the moment they landed, so you can feel free to paint this in pretty much any color you want. And once you're satisfied with those first colors, what you can do is pick another 3 random colors and start applying them to either the sleeves or the breeches. Now I've got here Violent Vermillion, which, as well as being a fantastic name, is a nice light, almost orangey red. And it's worth remembering that breeches, because they would have been washed more often than jackets and what have you, we're in an age before color-fast dyes, so they will likely be lighter or slightly more washed out compared to any sleeves or jackets. So let's pop Violent Vermilion over this chap. On this guy's breeches, I'm going to use Forest Faun. This is listed as a desaturated cool green, and yes it is. Then on the handgunner's sleeves, I want to use a more saturated color. So what I have here is Daemonic Yellow. Now obviously this would probably be quicker if you were painting these guys as a uniform bunch. So if you're looking at them as Empire troops or what have you, you can paint all the sleeves one after the other in the same color, or the leggings or what have you. But for our Conquistadors, like I said, uniformity went out the window real quick. So we got to adapt. And then we can move on to the puffy bits, the ruffs on the sleeves and the legs. Now this is another opportunity to use colors that you probably wouldn't all that often. So this fella here, his jerkin's going to cover to about there. And I have here Elderflower, which is a wonderful desaturated purple, violet kind of color. I've seen a couple of examples painted with a fairly similar color, so I'm quite happy to use this one. And it's a nice, like I said, it's a nice color you don't often see on things. For the halberdier, I'm going to use pure red, both on his, I want to say trousers, I know that's not the word, but on this bit and on his sleeves, I'm going to use pure red. You will find it's a little easier to apply if you thin it down slightly more so that it runs in between the little slats a bit more easily. And on this fella, I am going to use this as Barren Blue. Now, it's worth pointing out that the codpieces, some of them would be the same color as the ruffs, some of them would have been brown or beige. They weren't necessarily made from the same material, but sometimes they were, and for expediency's sake, that's what I'm going to treat them as. Now there are a couple of different types of padded armor which are included on the sprue. One of them, this one here, this is of Spanish make, but there's also one which has little horizontal rectangles. Now that one is actually an Incan design that the conquistadors very quickly realized, hang on, it's cotton, it's light, we can make it, we're not going to bake inside our armor. So having a couple of guys in those is a good idea. Paint-wise, I'd probably go for like a bony color before we come to shading them. But for these quilted jackets, you can also pick a color for them. They'd quite commonly be dyed. But I'm going to use here Command Khaki. Yeah, this is the stage at which we're going to see a lot of browns and beiges. So buckle up because it's exciting. And now at last we're going to turn to Leather Brown. Now Leather Brown is going to do quite a lot of work. So this fella's padded jacket here, for example, I'm going to do this in leather, but also any gloves and the shoes. You can mix up the colors that you use for the shoes if you fancy. You want to have these guys a little bit more fashionable, but for sheer speed and the sake of a little bit of ease and not having to buy a bazillion paints, just give them all leather brown shoes. Now, on some fellas, that leather brown will also work very well as a beard color. Obviously, you can start with pretty much anything you fancy there. But for a blonde finish, what I'm going to do is use here Wasteland Clay as the base color. Now, this is a quite a yellowy brown, and it is, yeah, definitely not blonde in and of itself. That's a great base for this. Now, we are finally starting to get somewhere. What I'm going to turn to here is Oak Brown for the wood. I really like this because it's nice and dark, but still has a bit of warmth to it. Now the wood on these spears and the halberds is going to be much lighter by comparison. So what I'm going to use here, this is Tomb King Tan. You might want to use something with a bit more warmth, so Command Khaki springs to mind. But because I know I'm going to shade this with something which is going to add a little bit of warmth, I'm not too worried about it being a bit flat just now. Now at last comes the fun part. What I've got here is plate mail metal. And at this point I'm going to go over all of the metal details with it. You might turn around, you might want to use, say, gunmetal on the weapons and plate mail metal on the armor. You know, change around some of the colors a little. I'm honestly not too fussed. If you did want to mix it up, it's very easy. And now one of the last base coats to apply is going to be for the belts, ties, anything like that. I'm using Dryad bark. It's a nice deep reddish brown, which is going to work really well for our leather. Now once I'm done with this, I'm going to whiz round and make sure that any little bits I might have missed or made a mess of while I was painting, I can tidy those up. And once you have done that tidy up, you're ready to go ahead and shade your models. Now, there's a couple of different options you can go to for this. You might thin down some strong tone or some Agrax Earthshade. Whatever you do decide to use, I would recommend thinning it a little with some medium. What I am going to use, though, is Marine Juice or Sonic Tonic. There's a couple of different names out there for it, mostly because people got quite funny about saying Marine Juice. But it's actually an old army painting method from the Forge World army painting team, so it does work, I swear. Now what this is a bottle each of Lamian Medium, Reichland Flesh Shade, both of those from Citadel, and one of Dark Tone from the Army Painter. Now, the reason why it's dark tone rather than non-oil is because dark tone, it's just got a bit more oomph than non-oil does since they changed the formulation on that. A common question is, can you use non-oil instead? And the short answer is yes, but it will look different. That's really the main difference. It's not going to shade quite as effectively, I would suggest. But this being quite a thin, warm shade, it's going to work a little more effectively over everything we're going to use. So let's give it a shot. So whether you've mixed it up in the palette or you've got a couple of bottles of it that you've made, which I certainly have, grab your tonic and we're going to apply this over the entire miniature. Now, it's going to look a little warm in some areas, and in others it's not going to look like it's doing a great deal at all. But to be honest, it's more or less perfect. It will look darker going on than it's going to dry, so have a bit of faith and apply it fairly generously over everything. We'll then give it plenty of time to dry, and we'll see what we get once it's finished. And then, once it has dried, you'll have something that looks like this. So plenty of shading in depth. If you were to start from a lighter skin tone, you might even find you're happy to just varnish these and pop them on the table as they are. Certainly as a unit, this will look fine. 20 guys, arrayed shoulder to shoulder, that'll look brilliant. We're going to take it just a little bit further, because I like to be quite fussy when it comes to things like faces and such, but bear that one in mind. What I am going to do, there are a couple of bits where it's gone just a little bit more grubby on the yellow, and on this fella's breeches in particular. Now, I didn't intend for him to look quite so much like Big Bird. Now, any areas where you have got a little bit too much, it's darkened down more than you would like, or you just want to add a bit more shape to some of these shaded areas, what you can do is go back to the base coat. So here I'm using this violet vermilion. I'm going to do this over the yellow on the sleeves on the other chappy too, just brighten up some of those higher areas. But I would recommend try not to go overboard. You won't need to do a huge amount of this. This is just because the color didn't turn out quite the way I wanted. Now, what I'm going to do next, I have here some ancient stone, and it is really ideal to have the most ragged, gnarly old brush that you've got for this. You really want to make sure that you've got next to nothing left in your bristles, so work it out into a bit of kitchen towel or similar. Some folks are going to tell you that makes things too grainy. I want the grain, so bear that in mind. Then what I'm going to do is, starting lightly at the base of his little jacket here, just to flick along the edges. And once I'm satisfied with what I'm leaving behind, that it's not going to be too much, I'll also start picking out those little puffy pantaloons. And we're going to use ancient stone as a highlight for pretty much everything. Try not to hit his weapons or what have you if you can avoid it. And as you can see, if you're careful with this, it's actually quite a natural highlight. So I'm going to do this over almost all of the colors. But I am doing this before I do his face for a reason. Now on camera, it does look a fraction more grainy than it does in reality. If you don't like that though, what you can do is to do the dry brushing before the shading step. I quite like how these guys have turned out, and a varnish is going to settle that a little more smoothly. In particular, I really like adding just a bit of texture to these historical miniatures. Medieval and Renaissance guys, they look right with a little bit of grittiness to them. Matter of personal taste there, but I think we're onto a winner. Now really the last thing we're going to do is to get in with some jasper skin, and we'll start finishing off their faces and hands. So you want to paint over most of the face with this, leaving just a little bit of that shaded topaz skin in the recesses. And the final stage on the faces, if you want to keep going, is to get a little bit of ruby skin. And we're going to do the backs of his knuckles. We'll do a little bit on the very tip of his nose. And if you're feeling saucy, if you can reach in there, just a little bit along the very top of his cheekbones to sell that look. Now once I'm finished with these guys, what I'm going to do is take them outside, hit them with a spray from the Color Forge matte varnish. I've really been liking using that one recently. and I will go ahead and base them. And the recipe for that will be in the description. So let's get a look at what these fellas look like when I'm all done. And so there at last, our conquistadors are complete. So again, it's worth pointing out you can use whatever colors you want. Uniform is a myth. And I actually quite enjoyed reading up on some of the things that the conquistadors were wearing, or rather not wearing. In particular, those big hairy cuirasses would have been ditched relatively early on once they realized that all they did was catch the sun and set the poor guys inside on fire. Who wants to be a steamed ham? So again, thank you goes to Wargames Atlantic for sending me along a couple of the sprues. Really appreciate the support. As well, thanks go to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my most gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much, folks, for your support. Really mean it. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.